All right. Well, this is part three of chapter five lecture. In this part, I'm going to talk about evolution and the brain. But before I even address that, I like to share a little bit about my own story with evolution, because I think some of you may be Christian and may actually struggle with the idea of evolution. And I thought maybe I could just share my journey. So I was raised a Christian, grew up in the church, and I'd say in my church there was never any sort of antagonistic relationship with evolution. I don't remember hearing much about it, and so I don't remember being like told that evolution was bad. But I certainly knew that idea was out there, and of course some of you may have been raised in a church that did have that position or in a family that had that position. But came into high school and I was sort of open-minded and again didn't have strong opinions either way. And I actually had a high school biology teacher who was openly a Christian. I it was a public school, but I thought it was interesting that my my teacher never had any reservations about sharing that he himself was a Christian. But he talked in class about the idea of theistic evolution, the idea that there is a God and that God is involved um, in the life on earth and in the world, but that God used evolution to accomplish his aims, just like God uses gravity to hold the universe together. And I like that idea because it kind of comforted me. But my story doesn't end there, because then I went on to college and I went to a secular university, and yet interestingly, and this is a lot of contrast. I went to but my Christian friends in at UC Irvine, they were creationists, and they started arguing with me. I had sort of adopted theistic evolution, but they sort of tried to talk me out of it, and they argued that Christianity and evolution were incompatible. That you cannot see it both, because Christianity teaches a young Earth perspective, and that evolution has a different understanding. And so I tried to learn more about their creationist beliefs. In general, though, I found it kind of difficult. I never actually fully embraced it, but I always felt dissonant about it. I never felt like, okay, boy, I'm a Christian who believes in evolution. I felt like kind of dirty about it. But it wasn't until graduate school, where I actually was at a Christian seminary, where I found resonance in the idea of evolution and Christianity. I learned how to read the Bible a little bit differently. I learned to read it as a story that helps us in our faith, that helps us understand our um, God's work in the world, but that isn't necessarily a historical account of exactly how the creation occurred. So to not think about it as a source of scientific perspective, but to see it as a source of perspective on who God is and what God has for us. So I would say I'm one who looks to Genesis for a lot of my theology, but I'm also one um, who has embraced evolution not as ultimate truth, but as a mechanism that God uses to work in the world. Okay, so I wanted to start off with that, because again, I know that some of you may have some struggles with that, and so I just wanted to share my story. All right, so um, to start off for this section, um, evolutionary psychology explains that our brains have evolved. Again, that our brains have adapted certain capacities that help us survive. And part of that is processes that help us anticipate the future, processes that help us remember the past, being conscious, communication, language, problem solving, all those capacities. And it also suggests that the brain has evolved in ways that are now maladaptive in today's society. So we originally detecting threats, sorry about that. Detecting threats was about just recognizing when we're unsafe. But now it leads us to chronic anxiety because in contemporary society, we are tricked to believe that there's a lot of threats, right? We watch the news, we see movies, things like that, and that leads us to perceive a lot of threats in our environment, and so we feel chronically stressed. And in primitive times, we would search for food. Now that leads us to obesity. And so that's some of the ideas that evolutionary psychologists would hold. And this perspective would say that humans have evolved certain brain structures that help prepare them to learn certain things. And there's certain forms of primary forms of cognition. So we have folk knowledge, propensity to acquire language, ability to navigate in space, control environments. All of that are these primary forms of knowledge. And then we have secondary knowledge that's more what we have from our education. And it's so let me give a few examples of this. So we have folk knowledge, let's say about training pets. I don't know about you, but I've heard this idea that if a pet pees inside, what you do is you put their nose in it and say no. Well, that actually doesn't work. I don't know if you've tried it with your pets, but what it does is make them fear peeing in front of you. And so they actually go behind the couch or hide somewhere, go when you're not around, and they'll pee inside. That's what they learn. Don't pee in front of the master. And that's actually, of course, not what you want them to do. You want them to pee outside. But that's an example of folk knowledge. And another example about vaccines, of course, would be that we trust our friends and family, unfortunately, sometimes more than scientific research. And so sometimes that shapes our thinking. Again, these are things that we've evolved, and then we try to put our education, our secondary knowledge, into a brain that is adapted to this way of knowing the world, right? This is a new way of learning. Education's a new way of learning, but we're trying to put it into our older forms. Now, I like evolution. I think it helps me understand it, but I want to say something about evolutionary psychology because I think sometimes people get all think that it's the bee's knees. They think about it as like, oh, this is such a insightful perspective. Well, evolutionary psychology, it does sound scientific, but is actually taking a theory, evolution, and then putting research findings into that theory and trying to use the theory to explain why do we see the way things are. So the theory of evolution is scientific, but applying it to contemporary human behavior, it is that's not science. It's actually I'm not saying it's not valuable, but it's more speculative. It's like, okay, why do young males engage in violence? Well, one argument would be that it's a way to impress females, and it used to work in primitive times, now it doesn't. And so that's a good evolutionary idea, but can we prove it? Can we know that it's true? No, we cannot scientifically test it. So we cannot compare our behaviors or brain structures with those of our evolutionary ancestors and say, oh yeah, this is why this developed. But nevertheless, I still think it's useful because there are lots of examples of behaviors that are very difficult or impossible to condition. And others are so remarkably easy that they almost appear to be learned automatically. So a few that are learned quickly. It's easy to teach a dog to play fetch. For a while, and we've sort of lost this ability. Our cat would actually play fetch. So we got our cat to play fetch, but cats don't normally do that. And it's interesting that dogs can do that pretty regularly. Cats are much less likely to play fetch. Again, that suggests that there's biological evolutionary differences between the two species. Another example is how we're afraid of snakes. People are far more likely to be afraid of snakes than they are to be afraid of kittens, right? So why is that? Well, I think biology is the only way that we can explain it, because there's not a lot of people that have had bad experiences with snakes. And so if it's not the from experience, then it would seem that it would be sort of a biological difference. So again, even though I like to be skeptical about some of the ideas, but at the same time, evolutionary psychology recognizes that genetics and biology really do play a part in human and animal behavior. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about learning in the brain. I'm going to give you a big picture about the what we know about the brain and how it might factor into learning. And I'll just be honest, this is a topic that we could spend a lot more time in. I'm just giving you some basic facts just so we can navigate it a little bit. So a few ways that we can learn the brain regions that are involved in human behavior. One way is through brain injuries. If a part of the brain gets damaged and capacity is lost, that suggests that that part of the brain is involved in it. So if I had a left frontal damage and then I couldn't generate speech, I couldn't talk, I was no longer fluent, that can actually impact, that suggests that this part of the brain is involved in producing language. If I had a temporal lobe damage on the left side, that would lead to difficulty comprehending language. And so the person wouldn't be able to understand what other people are saying to them. And so, again, that's one way we learn about the brain. Another way, less damaging, is through electrical brain stimulation. So you can actually stimulate the brain while surgery is occurring, and you can get certain reactions from it. We also learn from chemical brain stimulation, brain imaging techniques, a variety of different ways. Okay, so here's your brain. Here's your brain on drugs. So this is a big picture view of the brain, and what you'll notice is that the large portion of the brain, and I'll just move my mouse here. This is the cortex. The bulk of the human brain is actually made up of cortex, and then you have here the midbrain. This is well, the middle part of the brain includes the limbic system and hypothalamus, a number of different systems. And then down here, reaching down to the spinal cord, is the hindbrain. You could also add in one other additional area, which is the cerebellum. And so forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and sometimes, yeah, the cerebellum gets combined up with the brainstem. All right, I'm not going to walk you through all of these here. I'm going to give you some basic pictures of what they're involved. So if you want to know more, you can take the class Brain and Behavior, and you'll learn more about the functions of the brain. All right, so starting from the bottom, the hindbrain. The lower brainstem is responsible for basic physiological functions such as respiration and heart rate. So one of the things you could think about is there's essentially like three brains. Sometimes people put them together into, they combine the hindbrain and midbrain, and they talk about two brains. And I actually like that idea more. The primitive brain and then the more developed brain. So the hindbrain is, these basic physiological functions, and then the midbrain is responsible for waking and sleeping, and then just general arousal, which is like paying attention and being alert. Okay, those are very necessary, very crucial. If there's damage to those parts of the brain, you may not survive. But but of course, they're not all that interesting too. That's not really stuff that we're really gripped by. So the most human element of our brain is the forebrain. It's the largest and most complex brain structure. And its most important structures include the hypothalamus, the thalamus, includes, well, here they're including the limbic system with the forebrain, and then the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex. Okay, now you could take the cerebral cortex and actually divide it into 4 parts or 4 lobes. And so you have your frontal lobe in the front. You can see where the eyes are. And then there's this fissure here, a sort of a dividing line between frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Sometimes people say to think of the parietal as the peak, because it's right here, the peak of your head. The temporal lobe here by your temples would be a good way to remember that. And then the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is related to vision. And so you have eyes in the back of your head, which is one way to remember it. So the frontal lobe is involved in motor activity, particularly this part of the brain right here, right in front of the parietal lobe. And then up here towards the front are the more higher thought processes. The parietal lobe is involved in sensation, particularly this band right here, movement, orientation. The temporal lobe is involved in hearing, language, and speech. And then the occipital lobe is vision. Now, all of them are connected, so you cannot separate them, but they do have particular functions. And then the other way our brain is divided is into halves. And so you've probably heard this, we have left and right halves of the brain separated down the middle. And there's a principle of lateralization, which is that our brains are really, so we've got these advanced brain and lower brain, and then we also have 2 brains in the sense that we have a left brain and then a right brain. And there's a principle of opposite control, so that the left brain will control the right half of your body for the most part, and the right side of your brain will control the left half of your body. Now, there are sex differences in the brain. So one thing to know, men, we have bigger brains. But as you've maybe heard, bigger is not always better. Women's brains are, we know, better connected. So even though I always point out elephant brains are actually far larger than human brains, but I don't think any of you would want to have an elephant brain. So again, bigger is not always better. But men and women do have distinctively different brains. The brains of male and female children are exposed to very different levels of male or testosterone, androgens, and female estrogen hormones. And that seems to have an effect on the development of the brain. So we see differences. So men have more white matter and a larger parietal lobe where visuospatial processing occurs, and women have more gray matter and a relatively larger frontal lobe where language is processed. And these differences, again, seem to lead to some differences in capabilities. So you've probably heard that men are better with spatial, visuospatial things, and women are better with language. That does on average, not individually, right? There's some women who do better than men on visuospatial, and there's some men who do better than women on language. But on average, the differences can be there, and it really seems like men and women process language, spatial information, and emotion differently. Again, they're not staggering differences. So I don't want to phrase it like that, but on average, there really is some um, true differences between male and female brains. So another point I want to make is the brain, right? We hear about nature or nurture, but the brain develops normally only if exposed to relevant experiences. So chimpanzees have been raised in complete and utter darkness. And what they found is that those chimps will not ever, if they are raised in darkness for the first 6 weeks of their life, they will never develop normal vision. So their biology is seemingly fine, right? These are normal, healthy chimpanzees, but the experience is lacking. Again, this idea of nature and nurture just doesn't make sense. We need to account that they're both involved, because without nurture, nature doesn't develop properly. And of course, without nature, without a brain, it doesn't matter what kind of experience you have, you're not going to be able to do much. Another example, rats raised with toys and other rats, so they got to socialize, were smarter than rats raised alone in a typical cage. Again, and they were able to do studies of their brain and actually saw that there's differences in how their brain developed and how the connections in their brain. So some more examples. If you enrich an animal's environment, and presumably, we haven't done this, if you enrich a person's environment, it can result in brains that have more capillaries, so tiny blood vessels per nerve cell. And what that means is that their brains are going to be more oxygen enriched. And you can actually see that there's more synapses between brain cells. And enrichment, as well as exercise, seems to increase the survival of newly formed neurons. And again, enrichment is this idea of nurture, but you could see it's having an effect on nature. So there is a positive relationship between cognitive stimulation early in life and positive outcomes such as higher IQ or better school achievement. So I cannot say this enough. The idea of nature or nurture is just not a good framework. I know it's easy, I know it's ingrained in how we talk about things, but it just doesn't seem to account for the reality that our biology it develops with experience. I even think about things like therapy as we're doing talking, but I know that things in the brain are actually changing as we talk, right? Our brains are incredibly dynamic and plastic, and so our brains are always changing. And so the experience of therapy, talking with another person, the talking cure, is actually changing the brain. And I think that's why people can recover with it. Now, information processing in the brain, I touched on this sort of earlier, but let me expand on it. Okay, it's important to recognize our bodies are input and output, right? We talked about this with classical and operant conditioning, where we have stimuli, that's the input. We have sensations that we perceive, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. And so we've got input, and then we've got output of behavior. So the sensory information is sent to the amygdala for emotional processing, and then goes on to the hippocampus and cerebral cortex for processing into long-term memory. This is a very quick process, and the information is processed quickly for emotional content and then sent on. It's a very quick and dirty processing. The sensory information at the same time, except for smell, is also sorted to through the thalamus, and then it goes on to the cortex. So here's what it looks like. I'll try to talk you through this. All right, we've got sight, sound, taste, touch, and this sensory information. Of course, it comes through the ears and the eyes and the mouth and the skin, but it goes to the thalamus. And the thalamus is called the gateway, the sensory gateway to the brain. It's where all the almost all the sensory information comes through. But then the thalamus splits it and sends some of the information to the amygdala and then some of it to the cortex directly. This is a very quick process because the thalamus is close to the amygdala, and the neurons there are very, they can fire quickly. Well, what's the amygdala do? You probably have heard of it as the center for emotional content, especially fear. So what this is doing is, if you, let's say, see something, you're walking along and then you see something and it looks sort of like a snake, it's going to send it here. And instead of going here and having your cortex process it and say, oh, that looks like it's got scales, that looks like it's like moving in a certain way, and then saying, oh, that's a snake. Well, that could be a slow process. So that this process actually says, send it to the amygdala, and the amygdala just does a quick and dirty, oh, that's something to be afraid of. And that leads the amygdala to start off this, fight or flight response. And so you're going to jump, and you may in a few seconds realize, oh, it wasn't a snake, it's just a stick. But that's where the cortex comes into play, right? Because to survive, we need to process things very quickly. We need to respond to things very quickly. And that's what the amygdala can help us do. So Daniel Kahneman talks about it, thinking fast and thinking slow. We have a part of our brain, a circuit in our brain, right here, thalamus to amygdala, that processes things very quickly. And that's the thinking fast, very automatic, very rapid, but not very accurate. And then you have the slow process. Of course, it's slow, but it's more accurate, it's more logical, it's more, capable of pulling a bunch of information together, and that happens in the cortex. And so this is an important part. And then the involvement of the hippocampus, this is where memories are formed. Well, a lot of it is precognitive, right? The cortex, well, there is some linkages between the cortex and the hippocampus. It doesn't show it here, but a lot of our memories encode the emotional content, and that's because there's such a strong link here. So things like PTSD, it's important for us to know these processes, because to understand PTSD, you have to understand how the memory is encoded with all this emotional content, some of it outside of conscious awareness. All right, now just a few more slides. Other brain capacities, the brain continues to grow new neurons, especially early in life. This is called neurogenesis. And for years, we didn't know that was possible, but, and you've probably heard this by now, but we do have that capacity. The brain is highly plastic. So regions of the brain can change in size, the number of synapses. Again, that's really important. So a lot of learning seems to be about the formation and really the stripping away of synapses between neurons. And then just the overall organization can change with experience. So there's studies that have shown that violin players, when they've played for years and years, they have parts of their brain that are larger than at the beginning. And if injury damages one part of the brain, other parts of the brain can perform these functions, especially if the injury occurred early in life. All right, so a few clinical implications. There's a field called biofeedback. This is really about giving people immediate feedback about their their biological processes. So you can actually condition automatic responses. And so in biofeedback, you provide an organism information about their own biological functioning. So you put monitoring devices on them, and they can simply and accurately provide information about that. And if they're providing information about your brain, then that's a process called neurofeedback. So right here, I've got my Fitbit on. That's biofeedback. But if I wanted immediate information about my brain functioning, I'd probably have to have an ECG or something like that. It shows immediate to the second what's going on inside my brain. And then potentially, I could learn how to relax. I could learn how to sustain my attention, things like that. Some other clinical implications for ADHD. This is, if you're not familiar with ADHD, but I'm guessing you are, this is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's three types of ADHD. There is not, contrary to popular opinion, there's no such thing as ADD. But one type of ADHD is the inattentive type, and that would probably be what people mean when they say ADD, because they're not hyperactive, they're just inattentive. And so the second type is where the person is predominantly hyperactive and impulsive. And then the third type is where it's a combination of both inattention and hyperactivity. And what they found is that children with ADHD have smaller right prefrontal cortex than other children. And they have also found that adults with ADHD, it doesn't just disappear. They will show deficits in mental calculations that require working memory. Related to that, working memory is so critical if you want to work on your brain. Working memory is kind of a cool intervention to build your cognitive capacity. And I have a link here. I won't show it to you, but there's different programs you've probably heard of, like Luminosity and things like that, and they can help you develop your working memory. And basically, it's just practicing tasks that make you sustain your attention, keep you focused over longer periods of time, and it actually can lead to lasting results. Again, this idea of brain plasticity. So a lot of people start to think, this is the importance of saying it's nature and nurture, because if it's just nature, you're going to think, well, there's no hope. I'm born with what I got. I can't make it any better. I don't subscribe to that at all. I think, with nurture, you can have a growth mindset saying it's very possible for you to learn and gain capacities that you didn't have before. It may take a lot of work, but it is possible. And I think that's an important message. So that's it for this chapter. I'm going to end there and hope you enjoyed that. So, yep, we'll come back for chapter 6.